You want to give me a word? You want to have me give you one word that describes Natalia to me? Enigma. She won't tell us the truth of who she is. We are living with a con artist sociopath.
Now a story making headlines around the world. Is this a child or a grown woman?
The Barnetts believe the adoption was a scam all along.
They claim they were tricked into adopting an adult.
She's evil. I promise you, within 5 years, someone's dead.
What is it? Why?
She threatened to stab my sons, drag their bodies outside, and bury them under the deck. She tried to poison and kill my wife.
Bye-bye. She said, I pulled a knife on my parents. Big deal.
It's like a serial killer or something. It's how casually they put attempted murder into a conversation.
She was going to kill everybody.
You've adopted a kid and now they're trying to kill you. I mean, it's the stuff of a horror movie, right?
If you watch The Orphan, it's just like The Orphan.
Did you want to hurt him?
It's all gonna come to light.
She was an adult. You could tell by looking at her.
Natalia was a victim. The Barnetts are the predators. They just literally left her to the wolves.
I don't know that there's 100% one villain here.
Christine basically said that Natalia destroyed their lives.
We're in deep, deep trouble.
Regardless of her age, she was left feeling abandoned and neglected, alone.
Natalia was a child. I know that for sure because I'm a little person.
I think Christine Barnett is a sorry excuse for a mother.
Natalia, you still need to be on your wall.
When I found out what happened to her, and that was what broke my heart the most.
There were a lot of secrets in that house.
His minimum sentence is 3 to 16 years.
It doesn't smell right. There's something wrong. Oh, it smells like
Do you know the difference between the truth and a lie?
I didn't at the time, no.
No, you
I
didn't
was just listening to what Christine told me to tell them.
You just don't know that you're Barnetts.
There was domestic violence.
They will do anything to get what they want.
There were all these pieces to a puzzle that we couldn't quite put together.
You're saying you lied because she told you to lie.
Yes.
Michael and Christine not only lied to get her into their family, but they also lied to get rid of her.
This is one of the most twisted cases ever.
I know he's not the kind of guy that could do well if he had to go to prison.
You got a seatbelt? Buckle up.
I don't think anyone will ever get the complete truth.
So much of this is a mystery.
I still don't have concrete answers.
somebody's not telling the truth.
It is a web of lies.
I'm not sure you can trust anybody in this case.
We were all abused. We were all abused. I'm so scared. This will never stop.
I hope I don't overstate this and make it seem a little bit too Norman Rockwell American life, but life was fantastic. It really was.
This is summer 2010.
Life's great. Been married for about 15 years. We have 3 sons, Jacob, Wesley, and Ethan. Financially, we're doing great. We've got a literal brand new McMansion, 5,000 square foot home in a prestigious town. Got a driveway loaded with cars in it. There's a Lamborghini in my driveway, for God's sakes. We have 13 TVs. We've got 14 couches. There was hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank account. More importantly,
we were in a very tight-knit family. It really was the pinnacle of life.
Michael loved Christine dearly. When the flowers came for their anniversary, it was a dozen roses for every year they were married. So for their 10th anniversary, 10 dozen roses.
Christine and I, we could do anything together. And when we realized our oldest son, Jacob, has Asperger's or autism, we fought those fights. We were downright amazing at the things we could accomplish.
I'm Jacob Barnett, here with an introduction to scientific notation. I figured that since I was teaching it to my two brothers, Wesley and Ethan, I would be able to post it onto YouTube. Okay, so I'm going to finish this integral, d by dx.
Their oldest son is a genius and was moving through schooling faster than I moved through a pair of shoes.
I did not come here to frighten you all with quantum mechanics. Not yet.
We would get a message from Michael saying, "Hey, did you see the paper? Jake's on the front page," to "Christine's writing a book. It's been picked up by a publisher."
Cube divided.
He has a full scholarship at the joint Indiana University-Purdue campus. For Jake, fun is reciting from memory the infinite series of numbers known as pi.
3.1415926535897932384626433. Jacob's one of the smartest people I've ever heard of. They're traveling the world.
Jacob, when he was 15, got an award from the Vatican.
This was where the Barnetts lived. The garage was where Christine Barnett had her daycare. They were all special needs kids.
The Barnett family opened up a foundation, a place where parents and kids with autism could go be with other parents and kids with autism and feel normal.
We were proud of them, and they just seemed so happy together. The Barnetts had the picture-perfect life, it seemed.
So we went from early 2010. We're blessed with many things. By the time 2014 came around, I have 37 cents in my bank account. I have no wife. I have no children. I have no home. I have no job. My possessions at that moment was my car and a backpack of clothing. If Natalia never entered our lives, I never get divorced.
Everything on Natalia, they ruined our marriage. They interviewed me 3 times with a detective in a bulletproof vest.
What? What are they going to charge you with?
Jail. This was not Westfield PD. This was like, you have committed a crime and we're about to lock you up.
Christine,
I'm
listen to
telling you that I protected you from that. I did.
Christine, listen to my voice.
It'd be very good if you just quit talking. Quit it. We're in deep, deep trouble.
We had no idea what we were dealing with, and tensions were so incredibly high. It was a very rough time, especially for the children.
I'm Jake Barnett. Since I've last been seen publicly, in some ways, I think I've regressed. I'm in my dad's basement right now. It's in Indiana. Usually I say Natalia is my adopted sister, so then I guess I would say I'm Jacob, I'm Natalia's adopted brother. But that particular way of introducing myself is kind of irrelevant because I haven't seen Natalia in like a decade. I find the situation incredibly confusing. It's like I want to know what happened and I want to know the actual like truth and everyone's motives, but at the same time, I don't want to remember that, and I don't want to have to revisit a lot of trauma from my childhood. It's difficult for me to piece together what happened with adopting Natalia.
Before Natalia, we had been married for about 15 years. It's easily the best moment in time that our marriage ever had. We were so happy and comfortable that we had gotten to the point that, you know what, we started talking about maybe there's room here for somebody else. We were going to adopt a little girl out of Haiti named Gilberta. And right before that April, the earthquake hit Haiti. And suddenly our hopes were dashed because Haiti shut down all adoptions out of the country. So we were ready to adopt, but we missed our window. And then we get this phone call out of nowhere from this adoption agency in Florida called Adoption by Shepherd Care. They say, hey, we know you. We've seen your home study. We know that you have a charity for special needs children, and you've been doing that for a decade. We think you'd be perfect for this little girl that's going to be coming to us. She's a little person. She has dwarfism. Now, here's the problem. You got 24 hours to decide. And if you don't come get her on Monday, she's going directly to foster care.
Christine and I almost took it as a sign from above. Now we're jumping on a plane flying to Florida. It's exciting.
When I found out I was going to have a sister, I was really excited. We had some white t-shirts that we painted on saying, "Welcome home, Natalia."
We pull up in the town, and I'll be honest, I was a little taken aback by the adoption agency location. It was in a rundown strip mall, maybe on the wrong side of tracks.
Little house that's been converted into offices.
Didn't look like an adoption agency at all. First thing I'm saying to my wife is, check the address. This just doesn't look right. We're gonna get a child here? So we start coming in, and they sit us into a little room, no bigger than the size of this room we're in right now, and they tell us, just wait here, Natalia's coming soon. And you've got to understand, with it being a closed adoption, the adoption agency was not willing to share any details of her before we came down. They gave us 2 pictures of her. They gave us a Ukrainian language birth certificate. Birth certificate supported 6, September 4th, 2003. We were all excited about that. My youngest son was 6. He was also born the summer of 2003. We thought this was going to be a situation where they're going to grow and develop and be twins.
We're in there for about an hour by ourselves.
We sign paperwork pretty quick. Sign here, sign here, sign here.
We hear the front door open. That's got to be her.
We start peeking through the keyhole. There's a little itty bitty keyhole. It's a solid door, and we're looking and we're looking.
Like, oh, can I see her? I was really excited for her to come home.
About 20, 30 minutes go by, and we can see the door open, and we can see the other family leave.
Because she was adopted before. This is her family that adopted her the first time.
Natalia's left behind. They had flown in, dropped her off, flew out.
We never spoke to them, and we are just thinking, how dare these other people give up on her?
And we've been worried for the last couple of days, worried sick, that our new daughter's not going to like us. And the next thing you know, the door opens. Natalia's right there. She comes running in. She got this big smile on her face. She's happy as can be. And she's shouting, "Mommy, Daddy, Mommy, Daddy, Mommy, Daddy." We're overcome with joy and emotion. Oh my gosh, that day in and of itself, without context, is one of the 5 greatest days of my life.
She was very small. She had long, curly brown hair. She had brown eyes of pronounced cheeks that really stood out when she smiled. I remember the way that her hands are jointed is not the same as ours because of her dwarfism. Like her fingers, like sort of bent in a bit, like this. But I was overjoyed the day that I met her. The fun times I can remember with Natalia are pretty much from that first week where we were in Florida. We went with Natalia to Disney World. We were all excited to have her in the family, and Natalia seemed happy to join our family.
If I was a little girl needing to be adopted and they came for me, heck yeah, jackpot.
So we get to the hotel that night, and Christine's going to give our brand new daughter a bath. And I hear a shout from the bathroom. This was a "I'm not playing around, come here right now, Michael" shout. I get up, I go fly into the bathroom. And the color's almost gone from her face. It's almost like she's seeing a ghost. She's truly frightened, and she just doesn't know what she's seeing and what's going on. She says, Michael, look. Look down. And Natalia had full pubic hair. And I don't know what to think. Is that possible? Is that even possible?
Who the is this person?
Can a 6-year-old have full pubic hair? I don't know. Google's telling us, well, earliest possible time, lowest common denominator, 8. So we just go, okay, look, our mission, we were going to show love and compassion to somebody that never had it before. That doesn't make a difference.
I'm Kathy Barnett. I'm Michael Barnett's mother. When I found out that Natalia was coming, I was so excited to treat this child special. When they brought her home, they had a very large party to welcome her. She was dressed up in a dress. She had beautiful curly dark hair. And Michael was euphoric that day. It was almost as euphoric as the day Jacob was born and Michael came out of the delivery room. He was a happy man.
You want that? Here you go. Go sit and chew. Go show him. My name's Kimberly Franklin. I am Michael Barnett's little sister. When I first met Natalia, I was, totally prepared. I knew that she was a little person. And what really struck me, though, was that she almost looked like one of us. She had the dark hair. And she really looked like she could have been my brother's daughter.
My name's Rachel, and I live 2 doors down from the Barnetts, where they used to live. Nosy neighbor, that's me. I like to know what's going on in the neighborhood. We were friends with Michael and Christine, and our kids played together. Everybody knew who Natalia was. I have goosebumps just thinking about when they walked in with her. It was amazing. It was so uplifting to know that this little girl needed a home, and they opened theirs up to her.
Hi, Natalia. Hi.
And Christine was smiling, ear to ear. They were so excited. They have 3 boys. They got a girl.
I was looking forward to seeing how she'd react to the park we had across the street.
Here's their yearbook. So there's Ethan, and there's Grace. Natalia came to our house a lot to play with my daughter Grace because they were both 6, first grade. Here's Natalia. It's crazy. She's so cute in that picture. She looks like a sweet little girl.
Once we got back to Indiana, at first there was an acceptance of the situation with Natalia and the pubic hair. All that mattered was there's a little girl that needs love and needs a home.
But eventually we had a lot of escalation going on in the first few months that we had her. There was a day I came home from work. Christine's got a pair of Natalia's underwear. Christine asked Natalia to tell me what's going on.
Natalia, tell Dad it happened.
Okay.
And I can remember her physicalness at the time. Her hands were just out in front of her like this. And she said, well, I have a period. And I've been hiding it. And I just don't know what's going on right now.
Christine, that's not possible.
Chris found some socks that she had used in her underwear and threw them out the window. Chris was just mortified. She said, this isn't normal. What have I got myself into? And so I said, we need to start finding out how old she is.
I heard she had pubic hair when they first got her, and that
they found like period underwear hidden in her room. So that would be the thing that, as you know, not a doctor, as a layman, I'd be like, yeah, that's definitely not a 6-year-old.
Stand up.
After we'd first gotten Natalia, and we started taking her to doctors, within 2 months of getting her, Natalia needed foot surgery because of her condition.
Natalia has a very rare form of dwarfism, spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. There's only about 3,400 people like that on this planet, we were explained by doctors. It just so happened, miraculously, that a doctor knew another 6-year-old girl with a spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia living in Indiana. We were stunned. We're going to have her meet and interact with somebody just like her. How great is that? The other girl comes in. And for lack of a better term, Natalia is gigantic compared to this other girl. Their cranial structures are different. Natalia, she's got the full forehead of an adult. She's got defined cheekbones as an adult. The other girl, her head is not developed at all. There's no way anybody could look at this picture and say those two are the same age. So when Natalia sees this person that should be close to the mirror image of her and realizes we see it, suddenly she fills her cheeks with air, blows them out a little bit so the definition in her cheekbones disappears. So that starts to happen. We literally see her head change. It's almost like you got me.
My name is Elva Reyes. My daughter's name is Therese. She has dystrophic dysplasia, as the same as Natalia. I was hoping, that a long friendship, where they can grow up and, she has somebody to be able to talk about things. I mean, it's not, something that she has to feel like she's the only one in the world. But later on, when we met for the play day, immediately Natalia looks physically, it's really well developed. My first impression, like, your face doesn't look like a little kid. Can't really say an adult, but at least a teenager. And I was like, huh. So, yeah, and she was very vocal talking, like she can carry a conversation very well, like didn't have no issue. I was like, wow, they teach her very good English. A very smart kid for a 6-year-old.
I am Therese, and I am 14 years old. I was 6 years old when I met Natalia. It's pretty rare to see someone who has a disability like me, and I wanted to be friends.
I have a picture of you guys. If I could show it to you and just let me know what you think.
Definitely, I don't think she looked the same age as me. I had that baby look to my face, and as she had kind of gave me like an older kind of face look to it, but yeah.
And looking at that, do you think Natalia looks as old as you do now?
I think she definitely looks like she's at least 18, 20-ish. It definitely looks weird to think about. I was playing with actually an adult, not a kid my age that I would feel comfortable with. If she faked her age, I feel like that's weird to think that I was around someone who did that.
She's not 6. We had no idea what we were dealing with.
To them, it would have looked like they brought their little girl to a play date with a grown-up. And they never reached back out again.
Natalia told us very little about her time growing up in the Ukraine, her time in the orphanage. I don't recall her having any belongings from the orphanage, like I don't recall her having any Ukrainian toys. She didn't seem to know very much about Ukraine. Like one point early, we asked her, like, "Oh, what's it like in Ukraine?" And she said, "Oh, it's always summer there." And I'm like, "Okay."
Natalia, you want to tell us something?
I forget the part that you guys never heard.
You forget what we never heard?
Yeah, heard.
It's okay. It's all right.
We adopted Natalia because we wanted to help somebody who was in danger of never being loved.
But every time we ever spoke to Natalia about, hey, tell us about the orphanage, tell us about people you've known, nothing.
So we had asked her about the Ukrainian language before. Matter of fact, at the rec center where we had our sports league for the autistic kids, one of the neighboring tenants happens to know somebody who was born and raised in the Ukraine.
We thought, how wonderful would it be for you to hear your native language, your native tongue for the first time in a couple of years. The woman from the Ukraine comes in and just immediately starts speaking Ukrainian. I swear on all things holy, Natalia's never heard a word of Ukrainian in her life.
But you were there until almost 5. And we've got you at 6.
There was like a set of things that didn't add up.
We started early in the morning.
Natalia had no accent.
We're going close.
She didn't know the Cyrillic alphabet. She knew no Ukrainian.
Ukrainian lady starts speaking Ukrainian to Natalia. Not a word.
I think she knew if she spoke immediately that we put 2 and 2 together, and here there's no accent. She doesn't know this. Didn't speak a word for 4 days. It's almost like the jig is up, the little playful kid face goes away, and now we've got we don't know who she is. We don't know where she's really from. For all I know, she had been living in the Ukraine for 20 years and found a way out. For all I know, she's an American citizen that somehow got this to happen. I truly don't know.
Okay, so you told me some things that were not true.
The dynamic between Natalia and the rest of the family seemed to shift pretty early. There was a lack of trust. So that, compounded.
So you lied to him. Okay, so that's what you're going to be in the most trouble for. You don't lie.
Natalia did have behavioral issues, which certainly the adoption process it must be traumatic. I mean, abandonment issues are a thing, and Natalia was abandoned multiple times. She was with another family in America before she came with us.
Natalia was with us 4 months. And that's when we start to witness her dark side.
We had a 2007 Jeep Commander. It has 3 rows of seats. But Natalia would always try to sit next to my youngest, the smallest, my 6-year-old Ethan. And she would do whatever she could to upset him. She would purposely wait until she was next to him in the car, and then she would do her best to urinate on him. She would defecate in the car and put her hand into it and try to smear it on Ethan.
Yeah, it was a frequent occurrence for Natalia to soil surfaces that she wasn't supposed to.
What were you doing to bother Ethan?
I was farting.
Did you keep doing it while you were in the car with him?
That was the life my 6-year-old son had. To get into the car was like going through the haunted house. Another thing, if we went someplace in public and she made eye contact with somebody. We would climb into the car. She would get into the car. She'd get in her seat. She'd close the door. As soon as I would start to get into my seat and the car would get into gear, doors open and she's throwing herself out of the vehicle so people around her can see. The idea, look, a poor helpless little girl, and she was trying to get back to poor helpless little girl status. She was doing as many things as possible to cause hurt or harm or mental distress to the entire family. She's been with us for about 5 or 6 months at this point. And at this time, my boys are 6, 9, and 11. Natalia would find things that were important to them, like a Hot Wheel car. She'd hide them. She'd wait to be crossing the street. She would throw them into the street and make sure the boys saw it. She was baiting my kids to run in the traffic so they'd get run over. I can't put in the words the everyday abject horror that we had to go through and live with.
And there certainly was like a lot of fear. Like, what if Natalia actually harms one of us?
A couple of weeks after that,
I came home from work. She had been taking knives out of the kitchen and hiding them in her room.
Under her bed. I go upstairs. Christine has the knife. It was a big butcher knife.
Natalia was hoarding knives in her room, had like intentions to attack us.
I asked Natalia, did you have this under your bed? Yes. What were you going to do with it? I'm going to kill you in your sleep.
Michael and Christine weren't very vocal about the stuff at first with Natalia until it got overwhelming. And that's when Christine came and told me and sat down on my front porch with Wesley and Ethan and shared what was going on. Christine was crying. She was very upset, saying that Natalia wasn't who they thought she was. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, knives. She had knives in her room. The boys were like, yeah, this is really happening. Yeah. Natalia's really doing that. This is the time when I backed away from them because I was just in so much shock from hearing this story. I went to Grace and said, you know what, we need to find some new friends to play with, because I didn't want to have anything to do with that little girl. I didn't want anything to do with her. She wasn't welcome in our house. I don't want to try killing my daughter or me.
Michael really only told me by the time they'd gone through all these things that he was afraid. Whether that meant he was afraid of what she would do or could do or any of that, I knew that there was fear.
Absolutely, we reached out to the adoption agency as we were noticing all of these issues and irregularities. They were unhelpful. I was lost. I was getting no help from anybody anywhere. So we went through a few therapists.
Trying to find guidance, trying to figure out the right diagnosis.
Go inside.
It was really the third or fourth therapist we got to that seemed to understand what we're telling them and seemed to have Natalia's number. She pulled Christine and I aside and said, you're all in extreme danger. At that point in time, we already knew that. We had been living that. So we were not stunned at the danger, but we're stunned at the diagnosis. We were expecting a severe mental disorder that was out of her control. We were expecting schizophrenia. We were expecting something. We were expecting her to say she hears voices. She's hearing commands tell her to do this stuff. So she tells us she's a sociopath. She does things that you and I would consider crazy, but it's a plan. She knows what she's doing. She's in control of doing it. It's not a diagnosis where she's out of control and she can really be helped. She's a sociopath. That was the first moment from a clinician that we heard, you can't help here.
You're 12 years old and you're, just down the hallway is someone who's living with you who actually wants to harm you. That's a very scary feeling. And I definitely didn't feel safe around Natalia. I just was scared.
There was one night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, we hear a noise. Christine nudges me and wakes me up. And I jump up. I go looking for the noise. Can't find it here. I can't find it there. I go down the hall in Natalia's room, open the door. It's dark. She's standing dead center in the middle of the room with a blank look on her face. Natalia, what are you doing? I'm waiting. Waiting for what? For you to go to sleep.
It's absolutely shocking to hear that an adopted child was threatening the lives of her siblings and her parents. I mean, just really disturbing to hear.
One night, sleep in bed, everything's fine, hear a little noise. I open my eyes, and Natalia is standing at the foot of the bed with a knife in her hand. What's going on? How much danger are we really in here?
Was I about to die? Was Christine about to die? Were my kids about to die?
I open my eyes, and Natalia is standing at the foot of the bed with a knife in her hand.
No idea what she's thinking. No idea what's going through her head.
I'm frozen. Natalia, what are you doing? Nothing. Why are you in here? I don't know. It's just this blank look. There's no emotion. There's no feeling going through her. It's just this blankness. I don't know what I'm doing here. Natalia, put that down right now. And she did. Natalia, go to your room right now. And she did. But obviously, I sat outside her door for the rest of the night to make sure she didn't come out, she didn't emerge, something didn't happen.
Knowing that somebody like Natalia was living 2 doors down from me and has supposedly tried to kill her family, thinking that there's a killer in my neighborhood is mind-blowing. Just mind-blowing. You think you know everybody. You've lived here for so long. You don't know everybody. You don't know anybody. You don't know anything. But it's scary. It's very scary.
So we start going through lots of therapy. You start going through plausible deniability. You start to try to convince yourself she wasn't meaning to harm us. This might seem strange. We never, ever said, let's take her back. We thought we could help things. We thought we could improve things. We wake up one morning and Natalia is suddenly in happy, I want to be part of the family mode again. And she asks Christine, is there anything I can do to help? You're doing the dishes. Can I help do the dishes? So Christine says, sure, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you, Natalia. So Natalia gets on a stool and starts rinsing the dishes off in the sink. Christine goes to the other room for a moment, and she's got a coffee cup sitting on the counter. Christine comes back in. Christine screams. I come racing downstairs.
See a bottle of Pledge. I see Christine's coffee cup, and Christine tried to drink it and instantly tasted Pledge. Cleaning supplies had been poured into Christine's coffee cup. Christine is screaming at her, Natalia, why did you do this?
And she just says, plain old straight out, I'm trying to kill you. I'm trying to poison you.
Yeah, I certainly have that instinct now. Like, I can't really share a drink with someone unless I've, seen the surface of it the entire time. Well, it's probably rooted in this fear that Natalia is coming to, poison us. I guess I haven't really figured out a way to reconcile it, if I'm being honest. I'm still working through it. I think I might need a minute, I'm sorry.
Natalia, what are you doing? What is it? Why? Like what thought? Well, what happens when you have them?
The first thing they noticed was the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against your ears, heavy, unnatural, the kind that makes a room feel staged, as if something vital has just been erased. On a cold morning in Colorado, in the winter of 2006, a front door stood half-closed, a porch light still burning long after sunrise, and inside, a life had stopped mid-sentence. No signs of struggle loud enough to wake the neighbors. No scream anyone could swear they heard. Just absence. And a question that would linger for 18 years, hardening into legend, into rumor, into a cold case whispered like a warning. The house sat on a quiet residential street, the kind where people waved from driveways and memorized each other's routines. Snow collected neatly along the curb, untouched, innocent. Inside, coffee had gone cold. A bag lay open near the counter. Keys were missing. A phone, powered off. The woman who lived there, known, visible, rooted in the community, had vanished without ceremony. By noon, police cars lined the block. By evening, the word missing had already begun its transformation into something darker. Colorado, 2006. A year before smartphones ruled every pocket, before surveillance cameras watched every corner. A time when disappearance could still slip through cracks. Detectives moved room to room, narrating the scene into recorders, noting what was there and, more importantly, what wasn't. No forced entry. No blood. No ransom note. No goodbye. The house looked paused, like a film stopped mid-frame. And that was the first unsettling detail. Whatever happened, happened fast, or with consent, or with someone the victim did not fear. By nightfall, the case was already circulating on local news tickers. Mysterious disappearance shocks quiet Colorado town. Neighbors spoke in fragments. She was reliable. She had plans. She never missed work. She had talked about the future. People repeated these lines as if repetition alone could anchor her back into place. Candlelight vigils appeared within days, flames flickering against the cold, faces frozen between hope and dread. Investigators began with the obvious circle. Family. Friends. Co-workers. Anyone who had seen her in the final 48 hours. Timelines were drawn, erased, redrawn. A receipt placed her at a local store the evening before. A witness thought they saw her car turning onto a side street later that night. Another claimed to hear an argument, then recanted. The narrative refused to settle. Every lead seemed to dissolve just as it formed. Then came the first strange detail, a detail small enough to be overlooked, but loud enough to echo years later. Her vehicle was found, not abandoned in panic, not stripped, not burned, but carefully parked miles away. Too careful. Aligned between the lines. Doors locked. No sign of struggle. No fingerprints that didn't belong. It looked staged, almost respectful, as if whoever left it wanted to be invisible. The press seized on the phrase immediately, cold case in the making. Headlines hardened. Speculation bloomed. Talk radio filled the silence with theories. Some said she ran away. Some said she had secrets. Some whispered about someone she trusted too much. And as the days passed, hope thinned into routine grief. Posters peeled from telephone poles. Search teams dwindled. The town learned how to say her name in the past tense without admitting it. Detectives kept digging. Phone records. Bank activity. Email logs. Nothing after that final night. It was as if she had stepped out of the world cleanly, leaving only outlines behind. The absence itself became evidence, unsettling, deliberate. A disappearance too neat to be accidental, too quiet to be random. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. The case file thickened, then gathered dust. New officers skimmed old notes, circled the same questions, reached the same dead ends. Witness memories faded, warped by time and retelling. Alibis calcified. Suspicions drifted. The case acquired a label that sounded clinical, but felt like a verdict, unsolved. And yet, beneath the surface, something refused to settle. Because there were inconsistencies that never quite fit. A timeline that bent strangely around one narrow window. A statement given once, never repeated. A neighbor who changed their story in small, almost invisible ways. A friend who remembered a conversation differently years later. Tiny fractures in the official narrative, easy to ignore individually, impossible to ignore together. Investigators revisited the scene more than once. New technology promised new answers. Evidence once considered useless was tested again. Fibers. Digital traces. Archived phone pings. Old interviews replayed at half speed, then slower still, listening not for words, but for hesitation. For breath. For the moments between sentences where truth sometimes slips. The community never forgot. Each anniversary brought a fresh wave of articles. 18 years later, questions remain. Candlelight returned. So did anger. So did guilt. Parents warned their children. Neighbors still glanced at that house, even after new occupants moved in, as if the walls themselves remembered something they weren't allowed to say. And then, quietly, almost invisibly at first, the case stirred. Not with a press conference. Not with flashing lights. But with paperwork. A reopened file. A renewed task force. A name resurfacing in internal memos. A connection that had once seemed too thin now looked deliberate. Patterns emerged where chaos once reigned. Someone, somewhere, had started talking, or technology had finally learned how to listen. The phrase, cold case, began to shift meaning. It no longer sounded like an ending. It sounded like pressure building under ice. 18 years after that silent morning in 2006, movement finally rippled through the system. Subpoenas. Quiet interviews. Surveillance renewed. A life long assumed ordinary was suddenly examined under a harsher light. Old relationships recontextualized. Old choices reevaluated. What once looked like coincidence began to resemble choreography. And still, the public knew nothing. Not yet. Because in cases like this, the truth doesn't arrive with a scream. It arrives with a knock. A measured one. Official. Final. The kind that carries paperwork instead of sirens. The kind that rewrites history in a single sentence. An arrest was coming. But before the headline. Before the shock. Before the words, "ends 18 years of mystery," would light up screens and reopen wounds, there was a long, quiet path of doubt, silence, and buried detail that led there. A path that began in that silent house, on that cold Colorado morning, when someone vanished without leaving a trace, and unknowingly set a clock that would tick for nearly 2 decades. And even now, as the case edges toward resolution, one question still hangs in the air, heavier than all the rest, not how the story ends, but how it managed to hide for so long, in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the past would finally refuse to stay buried. The town learned to live with the silence, but silence has a way of fermenting, of thickening into something uneasy, something that stains ordinary days. In the years after 2006, the disappearance stopped being breaking news and became background noise, a name spoken softly at diners, a cautionary reference slipped into conversation when night fell too early. Colorado kept moving, seasons turning, streets repaved, families growing older, but the case remained, frozen in a specific hour that refused to fade. Inside police archives, the file expanded sideways rather than forward. New pages were added without answers. Each investigator who touched it left fingerprints of intention, underlined sentences, question marks in margins, arrows pointing nowhere. The early assumption that the victim had left voluntarily collapsed quickly, replaced by something heavier and more disturbing. Adults with stable lives did not simply erase themselves. Not like this. Not without money. Not without a trace. The early timeline became sacred, repeated until it felt carved into stone. Last confirmed sighting. Last phone activity. Last known movement. Everything after that was speculation. But within that narrow window of hours, contradictions multiplied. 2 witnesses placed her in different locations at the same time. A receipt timestamp didn't align with a camera angle. A neighbor swore a light had been on when police insisted the house was dark. Small inconsistencies, dismissed at first as faulty memory, began to hum quietly beneath the surface. Investigators returned again and again to the house. They reconstructed the scene in their minds, walking the same path from door to kitchen, kitchen to hallway, hallway to silence. The lack of violence was unsettling. No overturned furniture. No defensive wounds. No chaos. Just absence. The kind of absence that suggests trust, or deception, so complete it never triggered fear. The focus narrowed to the victim's inner circle. Friends were interviewed repeatedly. Co-workers, ex-partners, acquaintances. Each conversation followed the same rhythm: shock, denial, rehearsed cooperation. Most people wanted to help. Some wanted to appear helpful. A few spoke carefully, measuring every word, as if language itself were dangerous. One name surfaced early and never fully disappeared. It appeared in notes, in margins, in conversations that ended abruptly. Not accused. Not cleared. Just present. Someone close enough to know routines. Close enough to understand habits. Close enough to predict where someone would be and when. The kind of proximity that, in hindsight, always feels obvious. But proximity is not proof. And in 2006, proof was fragile. Digital footprints were thin. Cell phone data offered rough locations, not clarity. Text messages were limited, often unrecoverable. Surveillance cameras were rare, grainy, unreliable. The tools that would later solve countless cold cases simply didn't exist yet, or weren't trusted. So detectives did what they could. They listened, they watched, they waited. Years passed. Files were boxed, unboxed, reviewed again. New detectives inherited old questions. Fresh eyes saw familiar contradictions differently. One officer circled a line in a transcript, a phrase that didn't match the speaker's usual language. Another noticed a delay between a call and a reported reaction. Another wondered why a detail had been volunteered too quickly, too smoothly. The case refused to die quietly. Every few years, a renewed push surfaced. An anniversary article. A public plea. A short segment on late-night news. Each revival brought tips, dozens of them, most useless, some cruel, a few unsettling. Psychics called. Strangers confessed. People with grudges pointed fingers. The noise was constant, but clarity remained elusive. Meanwhile, life went on around the absence. Families aged. Relationships fractured. Some moved away, carrying guilt like luggage they could never set down. Others stayed, anchored by the unresolved. The town learned to coexist with the idea that someone among them might know more than they had ever admitted. Behind closed doors, investigators began to rethink the foundation of the case. What if the timeline was wrong? What if the disappearance didn't happen when everyone assumed? What if the last, confirmed, sighting wasn't real at all? That single shift reframed everything. Reanalysis began quietly. Old evidence was digitized. Audio enhanced. Notes cross-referenced. Patterns emerged that had been invisible before. A routine repeated too precisely. A behavior that looked normal until placed beside another. A coincidence that appeared once as chance, twice, curiosity, 3 times, design. The name returned again. The same one. Still never officially accused. Still hovering at the edge of suspicion. Investigators began to map that person's movements, relationships, stresses, and timeline in parallel with the victim's final days. Where they overlapped, the air grew heavier. There were financial pressures, subtle but real. Personal tensions that had been minimized at the time. Conversations that, in hindsight, carried undertones no one wanted to acknowledge. And then there were inconsistencies, statements that changed slightly over the years, not enough to alarm, but enough to notice when stacked side by side. Memory is a strange thing. It erodes, but it also betrays. People forget details, but they also invent them to fill gaps. Detectives trained themselves to hear the difference. They replayed interviews, listening not to what was said, but how. The pauses. The corrections. The moments where confidence flickered. Technology finally began to tilt the balance. Old phone records were reprocessed using newer analytical tools. Location data once dismissed as too imprecise was reinterpreted statistically. Patterns of movement emerged where before there had only been noise. A device had lingered in an area longer than expected. A signal had dropped, then reappeared somewhere it shouldn't have. It wasn't proof. But it was direction. The investigation narrowed again, this time with purpose. Interviews were reopened under the guise of routine updates. Questions were asked differently. Chronologies were challenged. Some people cooperated eagerly. Others bristled. One person, in particular, seemed increasingly uncomfortable, offering explanations that grew more elaborate with time. Still, no arrest came. Not yet. Because cold cases don't break with drama. They fracture slowly, like ice under pressure. Years of weight, invisible stress, microscopic cracks widening until one day the surface gives way. 18 years after the disappearance, a quiet shift occurred inside the department. A specialized unit took over. Fresh analysts. Fresh resolve. The case was no longer treated as dormant, but as unfinished. Old assumptions were discarded. New theories were tested without sentiment. One analyst noticed something chilling, a behavior pattern repeating across unrelated events, a rhythm of actions that matched not opportunity, but control. The same timing. The same preparation. The same after-the-fact calm. It suggested experience, not panic. That observation led to a deeper dive. Backgrounds were re-examined. Past incidents, once considered irrelevant, were pulled into the light. A minor report here. A complaint there. Nothing that had ever amounted to charges, but together, they formed a silhouette. And that silhouette looked familiar. The community, unaware of these internal movements, continued to live with the ghost of 2006. People still asked questions. Parents still warned. Journalists still circled. The phrase, cold case, had become shorthand for injustice, for unfinished business. But behind closed doors, something was shifting. Evidence long considered weak was being strengthened by context. Timelines once fuzzy were sharpening. The impossible was becoming plausible. The story people thought they knew was beginning to bend. And somewhere, a person who had lived freely for nearly 2 decades began to feel the air change. Subtle signs appeared, nervous glances, guarded conversations, a sudden interest in legal advice. The past, long buried, was stirring. Because cold cases do not stay cold forever. They wait. They watch. And when enough pieces finally align, when technology catches up to silence, when memory cracks under its own weight, the truth begins to surface, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability that no one can outrun. The arrest was still in the future. The headline not yet written. But the machinery behind it had started to turn, slowly, deliberately, pulling 18 years of shadows toward a single, irreversible moment. And somewhere in that machinery lay the answer to a question that had haunted Colorado since 2006, not just what happened, but how it was allowed to remain hidden for so long. Time does something strange to the truth. It doesn't erase it, it compresses it, distorts it, buries it under routine and repetition, until the original shape becomes difficult to recognize. By the time investigators reopened the Colorado 2006 case with real momentum, the truth had been folded over itself so many times that even the people closest to it no longer knew where memory ended and invention began. Inside the task force, the atmosphere changed. The case was no longer treated as a historical artifact, but as an active wound. Analysts spoke quietly, carefully, aware that one wrong assumption could send them spiraling back into the same dead ends that had swallowed years before. They stopped asking what had happened and started asking something far more dangerous: who benefited from the confusion? The victim's final days were reconstructed again, minute by minute, not as a timeline, but as a behavioral map. What she normally did. What she avoided. Who she trusted. What made her uncomfortable. Patterns emerged that had once seemed meaningless. A deviation here. A cancelled plan there. A subtle shift in tone reported by someone who had spoken to her shortly before she vanished. Nothing dramatic. Just unease. The kind people often dismiss until it's too late. One detail resurfaced with unusual gravity: a conversation she had reportedly had days before disappearing. At the time, it sounded trivial. A disagreement. A misunderstanding. Nothing worth documenting in depth. But now, re-examined through the lens of motive, it took on a sharper edge. The words were vague, but the emotion behind them, tension, restraint, unease, stood out like a bruise under thin skin. Investigators began to question why this interaction had never been pursued more aggressively. Why it had been summarized instead of transcribed. Why follow-up questions were never asked. The answer, buried in old procedural notes, was simple and unsettling. There had been no obvious reason to push harder at the time. No visible threat. No history of violence. No alarm bells loud enough to justify pressure. That assumption, that danger announces itself, had shaped the early investigation more than anyone wanted to admit. As the review deepened, another pattern emerged. Several people connected to the victim had offered statements that aligned too perfectly, as if rehearsed against the same internal script. Their stories did not contradict each other, but they also didn't breathe. They lacked the messiness of genuine recollection. They sounded tidy. Efficient. Safe. One investigator described it as over-coordinated normality. The team began isolating linguistic markers across interviews, repeated phrases, mirrored explanations, identical justifications delivered years apart. This wasn't coincidence. It suggested influence, shared preparation, or a dominant narrative quietly shaping everyone else's memory. That narrative pointed away from conflict, away from violence, away from accountability. And then there was the gap. A narrow window of time, less than 2 hours, during which no one could reliably account for the victim's movements. No confirmed sightings. No verified communications. No digital trail. Just a hole in the record, wide enough for anything to have happened inside it. Investigators began calling it the dark window. They rebuilt that window using everything available: traffic patterns, weather data, store hours, phone tower reach, even ambient noise reports. Slowly, improbably, the chaos began to align. Certain routes made more sense than others. Certain movements fit too well to be accidental. One path stood out. It intersected with a familiar name. The same name that had lingered since the early days. The one that had never quite disappeared from the margins of the file. The one associated with calm demeanor, cooperation, reliability. Someone no one had ever described as threatening. Someone who had always been helpful. The deeper investigators looked, the more that helpfulness took on a different tone. They noticed how often this person had inserted themselves into the aftermath, offering assistance, checking in, providing theories. How they had been present at key moments without ever being central. How their version of events had subtly guided early assumptions. Not through lies, but through framing. Framing is powerful. It doesn't distort facts, it arranges them. Financial records were pulled again, this time with broader scope. Nothing overt. No sudden withdrawals. No suspicious transfers. But patterns of stress appeared, obligations, pressures, quiet instability. Not motive on its own, but context. Enough to suggest that the disappearance may not have been random or impulsive, but the outcome of a longer internal calculus. As weeks passed, investigators found themselves returning to one unsettling question: if this person had nothing to hide, why did their story require so much maintenance? Interviews resumed, carefully. This time, they weren't confrontational. They were conversational. Investigators allowed silence to stretch. Let contradictions surface naturally. Let discomfort do the work. The tone shifted. Answers came faster, then slower. Details grew vague. Timelines blurred. Phrases like, "I don't remember," replaced earlier certainty. The confidence that once defined the narrative began to fracture under repetition. Still, nothing that could justify an arrest. That was the cruel reality of cold cases. Suspicion could grow enormous without ever becoming actionable. You could feel the shape of the truth without being able to touch it. Until technology intervened again. A routine audit of archived digital material uncovered something overlooked for years. A fragment of data considered too degraded to matter. At the time, it had been logged and forgotten. Now, reprocessed with modern tools, it began to speak. Not loudly. Not clearly. But enough. It suggested proximity. Timing. Presence. It contradicted a key statement that had been treated as fact for nearly 2 decades. That contradiction sent a ripple through the task force. If this fragment was accurate, then someone had been somewhere they claimed not to be. And if that was true, then the entire narrative surrounding the disappearance needed to be rebuilt. Investigators moved cautiously. They verified. Then verified again. They compared logs, timestamps, overlapping signals. Each pass reinforced the same conclusion. The story was cracking. Behind the scenes, legal teams were consulted. Prosecutors warned against moving too fast. A case built on circumstantial layers needed to be airtight. An arrest without certainty could destroy everything. So they kept digging. They looked into past behavior, not crimes, but patterns. Complaints that never went anywhere. Incidents brushed aside. Moments that, alone, meant nothing, but together suggested control, entitlement, and an unsettling need to manage perception. The image that emerged was not of a monster, but of someone ordinary. Someone capable of charm. Someone who understood how to appear harmless. Someone who knew how to stay just inside the boundaries of suspicion. And that, investigators realized, was exactly why the case had gone cold. Because the most dangerous disappearances are not loud. They are quiet. They do not announce themselves with violence. They dissolve into normalcy, into politeness, into routines that seem safe. As momentum built, the task force tightened its circle. Information was restricted. Notes were encrypted. Conversations were held in rooms without windows. The fear wasn't just of leaks, it was of tipping someone off. Because now, for the first time in 18 years, they believed the person responsible might still be watching. Still listening. Still living an ordinary life, while the past crept closer. The community, unaware of these internal shifts, continued as it always had. But something subtle changed in the air. A few journalists noticed doors closing. Requests denied. Officials declining to comment. Rumors stirred again, quieter but sharper. And then, without warning, the pace accelerated. A warrant was drafted. Not served, drafted. A line crossed quietly, internally, signaling that suspicion had hardened into focus. Evidence was being assembled into a narrative that could survive scrutiny. The kind of narrative that could finally be spoken aloud in court. The question was no longer whether someone would be held accountable. It was when. Because the truth, long buried beneath politeness and patience, was beginning to surface, not as a revelation, but as a reckoning. And once it broke through, it would not only redefine what happened in 2006, but expose how easily certainty can be manufactured, how silence can masquerade as innocence, and how close a secret can live to the center of a community without ever being seen. The arrest was still ahead. But the trap was forming. Slowly. Deliberately. And it was closing in. By the time the investigation reached its 18th year, the case no longer felt dormant, it felt restrained, like something held underwater for too long. Inside the task force, Every movement was deliberate now. Every word documented. Every theory stress-tested. Because once a cold case begins to warm, it does so unevenly, unpredictably, and often dangerously. The focus narrowed to behavior rather than events. Investigators stopped asking what happened that night and started asking how someone could live with what happened afterward. How routine could coexist with concealment. How normalcy could be performed for years without fracture. That shift changed everything. They began mapping life patterns not around the disappearance, but around the years that followed it. Employment history. Relationship arcs. Residential moves. Emotional cycles. What emerged was a rhythm, subtle, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Stability punctuated by moments of strain. Calm interrupted by unexplained changes. A pattern of proximity to order, authority, predictability. Control. Control, investigators realized, was the through line. The person now at the center of their attention had always positioned themselves near structure. Near routines. Near roles that projected reliability. It was a camouflage that worked, because it didn't look like camouflage at all. It looked like responsibility. Old interview footage was replayed again, this time with sound engineers present. Not to analyze content, but cadence. Breathing. Micropauses. Stress markers. The voice in those recordings hadn't changed much over the years, but the confidence had. Early on, there was ease. Later, defensiveness. Then caution. The arc was subtle, but consistent. When asked about the night of the disappearance, the answers followed a familiar loop. Same phrases. Same order. Same emotional tone. It was memoized. Memory doesn't work that way. Real memory degrades. It softens. It contradicts itself. Scripted memory, on the other hand, stays clean until pressure is applied. So pressure was applied. Investigators reintroduced questions that had been asked before, but phrased them slightly differently. They reversed timelines. Changed reference points. They watched closely for hesitation, for recalibration. Each time, the response adjusted just a fraction too late. Not enough to accuse. Enough to notice. Meanwhile, new technology continued to reshape the case in quieter ways. Data once considered irrelevant was reprocessed in bulk. Old logs were cross-indexed. Geographic movement was reconstructed with probabilistic modeling. It didn't give certainty, but it did provide likelihoods. One of those likelihoods was impossible to ignore. During the critical window, the narrow slice of time, when the disappearance most likely occurred, a device associated with the person of interest appeared to pause in an area it had no reason to be. Not long. Just long enough. Not definitively. But consistently, across multiple reconstructions. It was the kind of detail that couldn't stand alone in court, but it could stand inside an investigator's mind and refuse to leave. The team began quietly expanding their scope. Not to accuse, but to contextualize. They looked into interpersonal dynamics surrounding the victim. Power imbalances. Dependency. Emotional leverage. Subtle forms of pressure that never leave bruises, but shape behavior all the same. Friends interviewed years later admitted things they hadn't before. Not because they were hiding anything, but because time had softened fear. Small moments came back to them, discomforts they had ignored, comments they had rationalized. A look that lingered too long. A tone that didn't sit right. A sense that something was off, even if they couldn't articulate why. These were not revelations. They were impressions. But impressions, gathered in volume, began to form an outline. The narrative shifted again, away from randomness, away from impulse, toward something planned, controlled, and deeply personal. Still, the case remained fragile. Prosecutors demanded more. Patterns were not proof. Behavior was not evidence. Suspicion, no matter how heavy, could not carry a charge. What they needed was linkage. Something that tied intention to action. Something that collapsed possibility into probability. And that was when a long-forgotten piece of evidence resurfaced. It had been collected early, catalogued, and dismissed. At the time, it lacked context. It sat in storage for years, unremarkable, almost invisible. But now, viewed through a different lens, it glowed with potential. A trace. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just a fragment that shouldn't have been where it was found. Modern forensic techniques gave it new life. Tests were rerun. Thresholds lowered. Comparisons broadened. What once returned inconclusive now returned something else, not definitive, but directional. A connection. Investigators were careful. They verified the process. Repeated the analysis. Had it reviewed independently. The result held. It wasn't enough to make an arrest. But it was enough to change the tone of every conversation that followed. From that moment on, interviews became strategic. Questions were layered. Information was withheld to observe reactions. Silence was used as a tool. The person of interest began to show signs of strain, subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in demeanor. Less openness. More defensiveness. An increased need to control the narrative. And then came a mistake. A small one. A comment made casually, perhaps too casually, that contradicted earlier statements in a way that couldn't be explained by memory drift. It wasn't a major contradiction. But it intersected directly with the new forensic insight. The room changed. Investigators didn't react. They didn't challenge. They let the moment pass. But internally, something clicked into place. The story was no longer just inconsistent. It was collapsing under its own weight. From that point forward, every interaction was documented with surgical precision. Timelines were rebuilt again, this time anchored by that contradiction. Alternate scenarios were discarded. The narrative narrowed. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began drafting outlines. Not charges, yet, but frameworks. Possible angles. Potential vulnerabilities. What would hold up? What would not? The case, once considered unprovable, was now being spoken of in conditional terms. If we can show this, if we can establish that, if the pattern holds. The shift was subtle but profound. For the first time in 18 years, the question inside the task force was no longer, who might have done this, but how do we prove it? Outside, the town remained largely unaware. There were no sirens. No press briefings. No headlines. Life continued at its usual pace. But something had changed beneath the surface. The investigation had teeth again. And somewhere, whether consciously or not, the person at the center of it all began to feel the pressure. Because secrets don't decay quietly. They corrode. They leave residue. They warp behavior over time. And when scrutiny finally returns, sharper, colder, more patient than before, even the most carefully maintained facade begins to show stress fractures. The case was no longer frozen. It was heating. Slowly. Relentlessly. And as the pieces aligned, one realization grew harder to ignore. The disappearance in 2006 had never truly been a mystery of what happened. It had always been a mystery of who had managed to make it look like nothing happened at all. And that illusion was finally starting to fail. Pressure does not announce itself. It accumulates. It settles into the cracks of routine, into the pauses between words, into the moments when someone realizes the story they've been telling no longer fits the questions being asked. By the time the fifth phase of the renewed investigation began, pressure had become the dominant force, shaping every decision behind closed doors. The task force no longer spoke in hypotheticals. They spoke in contingencies. If this holds. If that aligns. If the timeline survives scrutiny. Their language reflected a quiet confidence, cautious, but unmistakable. The case had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer about discovery. It was about construction. They began assembling the narrative the way engineers assemble a bridge, segment by segment, testing load-bearing points, reinforcing weak spans. Each piece of evidence was evaluated not for how compelling it felt, but for how well it connected to the next. The goal was cohesion. A story that could survive challenge. At the center of that structure remained the same individual. Not accused. Not charged. But increasingly unavoidable. Investigators reviewed every interaction this person had with the victim in the months before the disappearance. Patterns sharpened. Frequency increased. Tone shifted. What once looked like casual contact now appeared persistent. What once seemed supportive now read as intrusive. Boundaries appeared blurred, not dramatically, but consistently. Control, again, emerged as the theme. Control of time. Control of access. Control of information. Witnesses who had previously minimized these dynamics began to reconsider. Time had given them distance, and distance gave clarity. They remembered moments that felt off, but had seemed too minor to matter. Comments that lingered uncomfortably. Reactions that felt disproportionate. A tendency to insert themselves into situations that did not require intervention. None of it screamed danger. But together, it whispered intent. Investigators revisited communication records, this time not looking for content, but cadence. Frequency. Initiation. Who reached out first? Who followed up? Who stopped responding, and when? Graphs were drawn. Patterns visualized. One line consistently intersected the victims at critical points. The analysis suggested escalation. Not overt. Not explosive. Subtle. Gradual. The kind that can hide behind concern and familiarity. The kind that often goes unrecognized until it's too late. And then there was the night itself. Reconstruction efforts intensified. Every available data point was fed into updated models. Traffic flow. Signal strength. Weather conditions. Even ambient sound decay. Investigators simulated movement scenarios, testing which paths were plausible within the known window of time. Several possibilities collapsed under scrutiny. One scenario, however, held. It placed the person of interest in proximity during the crucial window, close enough to interact, close enough to intervene, close enough to influence what happened next. It required no dramatic chase, no public confrontation. Only access. Opportunity. Familiarity. The simplicity of it was unsettling. Prosecutors reviewed the emerging picture with caution. Circumstantial cases can be powerful, but they are also fragile. Every assumption had to be defensible. Every inference supported by something tangible. They pushed back hard, forcing investigators to justify every link. In response, the team dug deeper. They revisited early search efforts, not to critique them, but to understand their limits. Where had they looked? Where had they not? What assumptions had guided those decisions? Certain areas had been deprioritized early on, deemed unlikely based on initial narratives that now appeared questionable. That realization triggered a quiet, but significant move, targeted re-examinations of locations once considered irrelevant. These were not public searches. No tape. No volunteers. Just discreet visits, documentation, and careful review. Most yielded nothing. But one location, revisited with modern tools, produced anomalies, subtle disturbances inconsistent with natural patterns. Not definitive, but suggestive. Enough to warrant further attention. At the same time, the task force began preparing for the possibility that the person of interest might sense the tightening net. Behavioral analysts warned that individuals in similar situations often react in predictable ways: increased defensiveness, sudden changes in routine, attempts to control narratives, or efforts to preemptively explain. And signs of that began to appear. There were inquiries. Indirect ones. Questions framed as curiosity. A sudden interest in the status of the case. A desire to help again, after years of distance. It was subtle, but noticeable. Investigators noted it carefully. They did not confront. They observed. Because confrontation too early could collapse everything. Instead, they focused on strengthening the weakest link in their chain: motive. Not motive in the dramatic sense, but motive as context. Why this person? Why this moment? Why this outcome? They revisited the victim's state of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance. Journals. Messages. Conversations recounted by friends. A pattern emerged: unease, hesitation, a desire to create distance. Subtle, but real. A shift in tone that suggested discomfort. One message, in particular, stood out. At the time, it had seemed vague. Now, it read differently. A line about needing space. About things feeling wrong. About wanting to step back. Investigators asked themselves what happens when someone who values control senses that control slipping. The answer was not always violence. Sometimes it was intervention. Sometimes it was persuasion. Sometimes it was an attempt to reset the narrative, to bring things back to normal. And sometimes, when that fails, something irreversible follows. Still, none of this could be proven outright. The case remained a mosaic of implication. Strong, but incomplete. Then came a breakthrough, not dramatic, not cinematic, but decisive. A routine recheck of archived materials uncovered a discrepancy in documentation. A time-stamped record that had been logged incorrectly years earlier. A clerical error, minor on its face, but profound in implication. Corrected, it shifted the timeline by minutes. Minutes that mattered. Those minutes placed two elements, previously thought separate, into the same window. Presence overlapped. Opportunity aligned. For the first time, investigators could say with confidence that the person of interest could not be excluded from the critical moment. That single adjustment tightened the entire case. Prosecutors took notice. Meetings became more frequent. Language sharpened. Risk assessments were updated. Discussions turned toward thresholds, what was needed to move from investigation to action. Still, caution ruled. An arrest, once made, could not be undone. It would rewrite lives, ignite media firestorms, and force the story into the open. It had to be right. So they waited. They watched. They continued gathering. They allowed the pressure to build naturally. And as it did, the person at the center of the investigation began to show cracks, not dramatic ones, but human ones. Subtle changes in routine. Moments of agitation. A growing preoccupation with how things looked rather than how they were. Because deep down, whether consciously or not, they understood something was changing. The past was no longer safely buried. It was being measured, weighed, aligned. And with each passing week, the margin for denial grew thinner. The case was approaching a point of no return, a moment when probability would harden into action, when years of silence would finally be challenged by a knock that could not be ignored. The machinery was almost in place. The narrative nearly complete. And the city, unaware of how close it was to a reckoning, continued on, unaware that soon, a name long associated with normalcy would be spoken aloud in a very different context. Because the cold case was no longer cold. It was converging. Convergence is never loud at first. It begins as alignment, small elements snapping into place with a quiet inevitability. By the time the investigation entered its sixth phase, alignment was everywhere. What had once felt like scattered impressions now behaved like a system, each piece reinforcing the next, each inconsistency pointing in the same direction. Inside the task force, language shifted again. Investigators stopped saying if and began saying when. Not publicly. Not on paper. But in the way they spoke to one another, in the careful urgency of their meetings, in the way silence settled after certain conclusions were voiced aloud. The case had reached a dangerous stage, confidence without closure. They knew who they were looking at. What they didn't yet have was the final hinge, the element that would transform inference into accusation, suspicion into action. And everyone understood the risk. Move too soon, and the entire structure could collapse. Wait too long, and the trail might cool again, this time forever. So they tightened their focus. They revisited the earliest hours after the disappearance, not as investigators, but as behavioral analysts. What did people do when the news first broke? Who showed urgency? Who showed restraint? Who asked questions that revealed more than concern? Patterns emerged that had been invisible in isolation. One individual had been unusually composed. Not calm, composed. Structured. Helpful in a way that seemed rehearsed. Offering information before being asked. Filling silences. Suggesting explanations. At the time, it had been interpreted as cooperation. Now it looked like narrative management. The realization was unsettling. From the very beginning, the story may have been guided. Investigators began reviewing the earliest media coverage alongside interview transcripts. They noticed echoes, phrases repeated verbatim, framing that mirrored private conversations. Certain assumptions appeared in public discourse almost immediately, as if seeded. That kind of influence didn't require power or authority. Only proximity and timing. An opportunity. The team reconstructed the first 48 hours again, this time as a communication map rather than a timeline. Who spoke to whom? In what order? What information moved where? Lines of influence emerged, faint but traceable. At the center of several of those lines was the same familiar figure. Attention turned to psychology. Not in the abstract sense, but in behavioral consistency. Analysts examined how this person responded to stress, uncertainty, and loss over the years. There were patterns, a tendency to redirect, to minimize, to intellectualize emotion. A preference for control over vulnerability. A discomfort with ambiguity. These traits, on their own, meant nothing. But in combination, and in context, they suggested someone who would struggle deeply with losing control over a narrative, especially one involving someone close. The investigators began to wonder whether the disappearance itself had been less about rage and more about prevention. Preventing exposure. Preventing abandonment. Preventing consequences. That theory reframed everything. Under that lens, the absence of chaos at the scene made sense. The lack of noise. The absence of witnesses. The apparent cooperation. It suggested a moment that did not begin as violence, but as interaction. A conversation. A meeting. An attempt to resolve something. And when resolution failed, something else took its place. Still, theory alone would never be enough. The breakthrough came quietly, buried in a secondary review of physical evidence that had been logged, boxed, and nearly forgotten. Not a dramatic object. Not a weapon. Just an item that had once been deemed irrelevant due to contamination concerns. New testing protocols changed that assessment. When the results came back, they didn't scream certainty, but they whispered connection. A trace. Partial. Degraded. But statistically meaningful. Enough to place the person of interest in proximity to something they had previously denied ever encountering. Investigators froze the room when the report was read aloud. No one spoke at first. The implication was too heavy. This wasn't proof of a crime. But it was proof of a lie. And lies, especially old ones, tend to unravel fast once exposed. The team moved carefully from that point forward. They did not confront. They observed. They waited. They wanted to see how the subject would respond to pressure applied indirectly. Pressure came in the form of presence. Unmarked cars in the neighborhood. Increased contact from law enforcement on unrelated matters. Subtle reminders that the past had not been forgotten. The goal wasn't intimidation, it was reaction. And reaction came. Behavior shifted. Schedules changed. Communication patterns altered. There was a noticeable tightening, a watchfulness. A sense of being monitored, even when no one said a word. At the same time, investigators reached out again to peripheral witnesses, people once deemed marginal. Old acquaintances. Former colleagues. Individuals who had drifted out of the story years ago. Time had changed them. Distance had softened loyalties. And with that came candor. Some admitted they had always felt something was wrong, but didn't know how to articulate it. Others recalled comments that, in hindsight, sounded like veiled admissions. Jokes that weren't jokes. Slips masked as humor. Moments of discomfort they had ignored. One witness, in particular, provided a detail that shifted the emotional weight of the case. A recollection of a conversation shortly after the disappearance, a remark made casually, almost flippantly, that revealed knowledge no one should have had at that point. The detail was small. Easy to miss. But devastating in context. It aligned with the timeline adjustment. It fit the behavioral profile. It echoed the forensic trace. 3 independent strands, converging. That convergence triggered internal escalation. Prosecutors were briefed again, this time with a different tone. No longer exploratory. Strategic. The discussion moved toward thresholds, probable cause, warrants, arrest viability. Risks were weighed. Outcomes modeled. The phrase, when we move, replaced if we move. Still, restraint prevailed. The case was too old, too scrutinized, too fragile to rush. Instead, they prepared. They refined interview strategies. Planned controlled confrontations. Anticipated defenses. Mapped likely responses. Built contingencies for denial, deflection, and silence. They also prepared for fallout. Because an arrest in a case like this doesn't just affect one person. It reopens wounds. It reshapes memory. It forces a community to confront the possibility that the truth had been nearby all along. And beneath all of it lay an uncomfortable realization: the disappearance in 2006 may not have required extraordinary evil. Only opportunity. Only familiarity. Only the quiet confidence that no one would ever look closely enough. But now, nearly 2 decades later, someone was looking very closely. And the past, long contained, was beginning to push back. The final barrier was thinning. The moment of confrontation, long delayed, carefully engineered, was drawing closer. And when it arrived, it would not come with chaos or spectacle. It would come with procedure. With paperwork. With a name spoken clearly and formally. And with the weight of 18 years pressing down on a single decision that could no longer be postponed. The machinery was no longer warming up. It was already in motion. By the time the investigation reached this stage, the silence around it had become deliberate. Not the absence of activity, but the absence of visibility. Doors closed more often. Meetings moved to smaller rooms. Phones were set face down. The case was no longer something discussed casually in hallways. It was compartmentalized, protected, treated like a live wire. Because now, the risk was no longer missing something. The risk was tipping someone off. Inside the task force, roles tightened. Fewer voices. Clearer chains of command. Every document logged, every conversation noted. The case file, once sprawling and disjointed, had been refined into a living structure, each element connected, each inference supported by at least 2 independent sources. The person at the center of it all had not been contacted directly in months. That was intentional. Investigators wanted distance. They wanted to observe behavior unprompted, without the distortion of interrogation. And behavior, quietly, was changing. There were subtle deviations in routine. A pattern of checking surroundings more often. A noticeable rigidity in posture during public interactions. A tendency to speak in rehearsed generalities when the topic drifted anywhere near the past. Nothing overt. Nothing illegal. But unmistakably defensive. Behavioral analysts flagged it as anticipatory stress. The kind that appears when someone senses a threat they can't see. Meanwhile, prosecutors began drafting the outline of a case theory, not a narrative for court yet, but a framework. It centered on opportunity, access, and control. Not on impulse, not on rage, but on a moment where influence turned into finality. The theory did not require a dramatic confrontation. It required proximity, familiarity, and a decision made in a narrow window of time. A decision followed by years of concealment through normalcy. That concept was chilling in its simplicity. The team revisited the earliest missing person reports with fresh eyes. They examined who had initiated contact with authorities, how quickly, and with what framing. One detail, long overlooked, now stood out: the speed with which a particular explanation had been offered, almost preemptively, before alternatives could even be considered. It had shaped the initial search parameters. It had shaped where police looked, and where they didn't. That early framing had narrowed the investigation before it truly began. And it had come from someone who, at the time, appeared helpful, cooperative, even concerned. The realization landed heavily: the investigation's earliest assumptions may have been guided, unintentionally, by the very person now under scrutiny. This reframing forced a painful reassessment of the first days after the disappearance. Decisions once considered reasonable now looked constrained. Paths not taken loomed large in hindsight. Investigators felt the weight of that. But regret could not alter the past. Only clarity could shape what came next. They turned again to evidence, not to find something new, but but to see what had always been there. They scrutinized phrasing in early reports, compared handwriting, cross-checked timestamps, looked for subtle inconsistencies in documentation that might indicate influence or interference. One discrepancy, buried in a routine form, began to glow under scrutiny. A time entry. Slightly altered. Not falsified, adjusted. Just enough to align with a narrative. It was the kind of thing that could happen innocently. Or intentionally. That adjustment placed the person of interest one step further from scrutiny in the crucial window. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Internal reviews followed. Quiet ones. Sensitive ones. The possibility that early documentation had been shaped, even subtly, by bias or assumption was deeply uncomfortable. But it had to be confronted. The team expanded its scope to include institutional behavior. How decisions were made. Who influenced them. Why certain avenues were deprioritized. This was not about blame. It was about understanding how a case could drift. In doing so, they uncovered a pattern of deference. The person now under suspicion had been perceived as credible, stable, cooperative. That perception had carried weight. It had softened scrutiny at critical moments. Perception, it turned out, had been a powerful shield. As the investigation recalibrated, pressure increased quietly but steadily. Surveillance was tightened. Movements were noted. Communications observed where legally permissible. Every interaction was logged. Still, there was no confrontation. The goal was not confession. It was confirmation. And confirmation required patience. Then came a turning point, subtle but decisive. A third-party witness came forward, not with new information, but with a clarification. Something they had said years earlier, they now realized, hadn't been entirely accurate. Not intentionally false, just incomplete. They had assumed certain facts based on what they were told. Now, with distance, they recognized the assumption. That correction shifted a small, but crucial detail in the timeline. It narrowed the window again. And in doing so, it eliminated several alternative explanations that had lingered for years. The circle tightened. The task force now had convergence on 3 fronts: behavioral, circumstantial, and forensic. None alone was enough. Together, they formed a structure strong enough to support the next step. Prosecutors reviewed the case one more time. This time, the tone was different. They began drafting language not for internal discussion, but for legal action. Careful language. Precise language. Language that anticipated defense arguments before they were ever spoken. They discussed arrest logistics. Timing. Location. Visibility. Risk. Because arrests in cases like this are not just legal acts, they are seismic events. They ripple outward, touching families, reputations, entire communities. The question was no longer whether to act. It was how. And when. The decision, when it came, was quiet. A date was selected. A window identified. A plan finalized. Those involved understood the gravity. Years of work, years of waiting, converging on a single moment that would redefine everything that came before it. Still, nothing outward changed. The person at the center of it all continued their routines, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, that the invisible boundary around them was closing. The town went about its days. The case remained officially unsolved. But behind the scenes, the machinery had reached its final configuration. The last checks were underway. Warrants were being prepared. Affidavits finalized. And somewhere in a quiet office, A file that had once been stamped cold was now marked with a different, heavier word. Pending. The next step would no longer be analytical. It would be decisive. And once taken, it would transform 18 years of silence into a single, irreversible moment, the moment when the past would finally step forward and demand to be answered. That moment was close. Closer than anyone outside the room could possibly imagine. The days leading up to the operation carried a peculiar stillness, the kind that settles before a storm no one is allowed to name. Inside the task force, voices were lower, movements more economical. Everyone understood that the work had shifted from interpretation to execution. There would be no more theories after this. Only outcomes. Every detail of the plan was rehearsed, revised, and rehearsed again. Not because it was complex, but because it had to be flawless. An arrest in a case this old carried weight far beyond procedure. One misstep could unravel years of quiet reconstruction. One leak could compromise everything. The warrant language was finalized with surgical precision. Each sentence carried years of analysis. Each phrase anchored in corroboration. Nothing speculative. Nothing emotional. Just facts, stacked carefully, designed to withstand resistance. Investigators read it again and again, not out of doubt, but out of respect for what it represented. 18 years of unanswered questions distilled into legal form. Outside the task force, life continued as usual. The town moved through its routines unaware that its long-standing ghost was about to be named. Coffee shops opened. Traffic thickened. People passed one another on sidewalks without realizing how close they were to a moment that would redraw their collective memory. Surveillance confirmed what analysts had anticipated. The subject maintained routine. Predictable movements. Familiar routes. No sign of flight. No sudden disruptions. That consistency, once reassuring, now felt like denial hardened into habit. On the morning chosen for action, the air carried a muted tension. Not urgency, control. The kind of quiet that comes from preparation done well. Teams moved into position without spectacle. No sirens. No announcements. Just coordination. The location was ordinary. Almost disarmingly so. A place that blended seamlessly into its surroundings. That ordinariness was part of what made the moment so unsettling. Nothing about the setting suggested history, or consequence, or the weight of nearly 2 decades. The approach was deliberate. Officers identified themselves calmly. Clearly. No raised voices. No rush. Just procedure. When the door opened, there was a flicker, recognition, perhaps, or something close to it. A hesitation too brief to name, but long enough to notice. The moment stretched, suspended between past and present. The arrest was executed without resistance. No outburst. No denial. No dramatic reaction. Just a tightening of posture, a slight shift in expression, and then compliance. The kind of response that reads differently depending on how closely you're watching. As cuffs were secured, a chapter closed quietly. Inside the arresting officer's report, the language was sterile. Time. Location. Compliance. Rights read. But behind those lines lay the gravity of what had just occurred, the first tangible answer in a case that had haunted a community for 18 years. News of the arrest did not break immediately. Authorities moved cautiously, confirming details, coordinating messaging, preparing for impact. They knew what would happen once the information became public. When it did, it moved fast. Arrest made in 2006 Colorado cold case. The headline traveled quickly, reshaped and reposted, stripped down to its most shocking elements. 18 years. Unsolved. Arrest. The words carried weight all on their own. Shock rippled outward. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the news with the person they thought they knew. Colleagues reread old memories through a new lens. Friends scrolled in disbelief. Some felt vindicated. Others felt betrayed. Many felt both at once. The name, now public, landed heavily. It was familiar. Ordinary. The kind of name that had never attracted attention. That ordinariness became part of the shock. The realization that nothing about it had ever stood out. Press conferences followed, careful and restrained. Officials confirmed the arrest, emphasized that the investigation was ongoing, and avoided specifics. They spoke of persistence, of advances in technology, of never giving up. They did not speak of guilt. Not yet. Behind the scenes, however, the process moved swiftly. The arrested individual was processed, photographed, fingerprinted. Formal charges were prepared. Legal teams mobilized. The machinery of the justice system began its slow, grinding motion. Interviews resumed, now with a very different tone. This time, questions were direct. Evidence was referenced. Timelines challenged openly. The protective distance of ambiguity was gone. The responses changed. Where there had once been fluid explanations, there was now caution. Where there had been cooperation, there was now calculation. Silence appeared more often. Requests for counsel followed. And still, no confession came. But confession was never the goal. What mattered was alignment, whether the evidence could stand together under scrutiny, whether it could carry the weight of what it implied. Outside, the community grappled with the news. Old memories resurfaced. Conversations restarted. People revisited where they had been in 2006, what they remembered, what they had assumed. Some felt relief that the case was no longer frozen in uncertainty. Others felt a new unease, realizing how close the truth may have always been. The arrest reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Families were forced to relive grief long compartmentalized. Questions resurfaced. Emotions surged. And yet, beneath the upheaval, there was a sense of movement, of something long stuck finally shifting. Inside the investigation, attention turned toward what came next. Prosecutors began assembling their case in earnest. Evidence was catalogued for trial. Witness lists were refined. Expert testimony prepared. Every detail was examined through the lens of how it would withstand challenge. The narrative that had taken years to assemble now had to be translated into a coherent argument. One that could convince 12 strangers beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden was immense. But so was the resolve. Because the arrest was not the end of the story. It was the threshold. Beyond it lay interrogation rooms, courtrooms, motions, hearings, and the slow, methodical unraveling of a life built around avoidance. The past, once distant, was now present. The silence that had protected it was gone. And as the legal process began to turn, one truth became impossible to ignore. The mystery that had defined nearly 2 decades was no longer a question of if answers would come, but how much of the truth would finally be exposed. The cold case had crossed into a new phase. Not resolution. Reckoning. And that reckoning had only just begun. The courtroom did not feel like a climax. It felt like a holding chamber, a place where time slowed and every movement carried weight. The arrest had shattered the illusion of permanence, but it had not delivered closure. That would take something far more difficult, proof that could survive doubt. In the days following the arrest, the narrative fractured into competing versions of the same story. Defense filings arrived quickly, precise and restrained, pushing back against implication and inference. Prosecutors responded with equal restraint, revealing only what was necessary, keeping the rest sealed behind procedural language. To the public, it looked like a stalemate. Behind the scenes, it was anything but. The investigation intensified rather than concluded. Now that the barrier of silence had cracked, investigators were allowed to revisit everything with purpose. Subpoenas expanded. Old digital records were re-examined with updated authorization. Witnesses who had once been peripheral were recontacted, this time under oath. And slowly, the shape of the case began to sharpen. What had once been fragments started to interlock. A timeline emerged that no longer relied on assumption, but on convergence, multiple independent strands pointing toward the same narrow window of time. Each strand on its own was circumstantial. Together, they were structural. The prosecution focused on cohesion. Not spectacle. Not shock. They built the case the way architects build load-bearing walls, with redundancy. If one element weakened, another would carry the weight. They leaned heavily on behavior. Not motive in the dramatic sense, but motive as pressure, accumulating, persistent, and contextual. They mapped relationships, power dynamics, emotional dependencies, moments of imbalance. They showed how control could masquerade as care, how proximity could become leverage. Expert witnesses were brought in quietly, consulted long before any courtroom appearance. Specialists in behavioral analysis, memory reconstruction, and forensic interpretation reviewed the material independently. Their conclusions did not rely on sensational claims. They spoke in probabilities, tendencies, consistencies. Their consensus was unsettlingly aligned. The pattern, they said, was not random. It was organized. Meanwhile, the defense worked to dismantle the narrative piece by piece. They challenged the reliability of decades-old memories. They questioned the integrity of delayed forensic analysis. They argued contamination, confirmation bias, tunnel vision. They emphasized the absence of a body, the absence of a confession, the absence of direct evidence. And they were not wrong. The case lived in the gray. That gray became the battlefield. In pre-trial hearings, both sides tested their footing. Motions were filed. Evidence was argued. Some was admitted. Some excluded. Each ruling subtly reshaped the path forward. The judge's tone was measured, deliberate. The court understood the gravity of what it was being asked to consider. This was not just a legal proceeding. It was an attempt to reconstruct a vanished moment in time. Outside the courtroom, attention intensified. Media outlets returned to archives, replaying old footage, resurfacing forgotten headlines. The phrase, cold case, appeared everywhere, paired now with words like breakthrough and arrest. The story took on a second life, reframed through the lens of accountability. Public opinion split. Some saw justice finally catching up. Others urged caution, wary of narrative momentum replacing proof. Families connected to the case felt the weight most acutely. For them, the arrest reopened wounds they had learned to live around. Hope mingled with dread. Closure dangled just out of reach. Inside the prosecution's strategy room, the focus narrowed to one central challenge: translating complexity into clarity. They had to tell a story that made sense not just to experts, but to ordinary people. A story that explained how someone could disappear without chaos. How a life could vanish into routine. How silence could persist for 18 years. They decided to anchor everything to one idea: control. Control of narrative. Control of access. Control of perception. They showed how early framing shaped the search. How certain assumptions guided attention away from inconvenient questions. How normalcy itself became camouflage. They demonstrated how small actions, repeated consistently, can have enormous cumulative effect. They illustrated how opportunity, familiarity, and timing can converge without violence, without witnesses, without spectacle. And they argued that this convergence was not coincidence. Behind closed doors, preparations intensified. Witnesses were coached not on what to say, but on how to say it clearly. Experts refined language. Exhibits were tested. Timelines were simplified. The prosecution knew that the case would be won or lost on coherence. The defense, in turn, prepared to exploit every gap. They highlighted uncertainty. They emphasized elapsed time. They questioned memory reliability. They underscored the lack of physical remains. They painted the case as an attempt to force resolution where none existed. Both sides were preparing for a long fight. But something unexpected began to happen. As the case moved forward, new information began to surface, not from investigators, but from the periphery. People who had never spoken before came forward. Some were motivated by conscience. Others by the realization that silence now carried its own weight. A former acquaintance recalled an interaction that suddenly felt different in light of the arrest. A passing comment. A strange reaction. A detail that had once seemed irrelevant now took on meaning. Another individual produced an old message, long forgotten, that contradicted a key assertion made early in the case. It wasn't definitive. But it was consistent. Each new piece was small. But together, they tightened the circle. The prosecution added them carefully, cautiously, aware that too much at once could overwhelm or confuse. The goal was not to flood the case, but to clarify it. As the pretrial phase deepened, the accused remained largely silent. Public appearances were minimal. Statements were brief, filtered through counsel. The silence itself became part of the narrative, not as evidence, but as atmosphere. The community watched closely. Every hearing drew attention. Every filing sparked discussion. People who had lived with uncertainty for nearly 2 decades now found themselves parsing legal language, searching for meaning between lines. And beneath it all, the central question persisted: could a story built from fragments truly hold? The answer was not yet clear. But one thing was. The case had crossed a threshold from investigation to confrontation. The past was no longer being studied. It was being challenged. And as the machinery of justice turned, slowly and methodically, the pressure mounted on everyone involved: investigators, attorneys, witnesses, and most of all, the person whose ordinary life had now been split cleanly into before and after. Because once a case reaches this stage, there is no return to anonymity. No retreat into silence. Only the long, public process of reckoning, where every word, every memory, every omission is weighed. And where the truth, whatever shape it ultimately takes, must finally step into the light. The waiting became its own kind of pressure, thick and relentless, settling over the courtroom, the town, the families, like a low atmospheric weight no one could escape. By the time the trial phase approached in earnest, the case was no longer just a cold case reopened. It had become a referendum on memory, on time, on whether truth could survive 18 years of erosion. Every motion, every filing, every whispered update carried the gravity of something irreversible drawing closer. Jury selection began under an unusual hush. Prospective jurors were questioned carefully, almost delicately, about their exposure to the case. Many had already heard fragments, headlines flashing, cold case solved, late-night segments replaying blurred photographs, podcasts dissecting theories with clinical obsession. The court sought neutrality, but neutrality was fragile in a story that had lived so long in public imagination. Those ultimately selected were told, again and again, that this was not a story, not a documentary, not a headline. It was evidence, testimony, law. And yet, the atmosphere made that distinction hard to maintain. When opening statements finally arrived, they landed not like explosions, but like slow doors creaking open. The prosecution spoke first, measured and controlled, resisting theatrical instinct. They framed the case not as a mystery resurrected, but as a narrative finally allowed to finish a sentence interrupted years ago. They spoke of patterns, of opportunity, of silence that functioned as action. They did not promise certainty, they promised coherence. They told the jury they would see how ordinary routines concealed extraordinary intent. How trust became access. How absence became normalized. How time, rather than erasing evidence, had sharpened it. The defense followed with a contrasting tone, crisp, restrained, almost surgical. They warned against emotional gravity. Against the temptation to complete the story simply because it had lingered unfinished for so long. They emphasized that suspicion is not proof, and alignment is not causation. They framed the prosecution's theory as a mosaic built from inference rather than fact. The stage was set. Then came the witnesses. The first were procedural officers, analysts, archivists, people who had touched the case at different stages across 2 decades. Their testimony was methodical, sometimes dry, but foundational. They described how the initial investigation unfolded, where it stalled, what assumptions guided early decisions. They acknowledged limitations, lost opportunities, constraints of technology at the time. There was no defensiveness in their tone, only quiet recognition. As testimony progressed, the timeline began to assemble itself in front of the jury like a slow, deliberate reconstruction. Dates, times, movements, intersections. Nothing dramatic on its own, but cumulative, deliberate. Then came the witnesses whose voices carried weight beyond data. Individuals who had known the victim. People who had lived adjacent to the disappearance without realizing it at the time. Their recollections were hesitant, imperfect, but emotionally charged. They spoke of routines disrupted, of silences that felt wrong only in hindsight, of moments that now replayed differently under the harsh light of context. One witness paused frequently, struggling to reconcile memory with guilt for not noticing sooner, for assuming explanations, for trusting normalcy. Another described a conversation that once seemed trivial, now reinterpreted as a warning wrapped in ambiguity. The words themselves were unremarkable. It was the timing that gave them weight. The courtroom listened intently. Even the smallest detail seemed to echo. Expert testimony followed, and with it, a shift in tone. The language became more precise, more technical. Specialists walked the jury through behavioral consistencies, through patterns of concealment, through how long-term deception often relies less on elaborate planning and more on repetition and confidence. They explained how absence can be managed, how narratives are maintained, how silence can be active rather than passive. One expert described how people often imagine crimes as explosive moments, when in reality they are frequently quiet, procedural, incremental. A series of decisions rather than a single act. Another explained memory decay, not as failure, but as evolution. How recollections change not because of dishonesty, but because the brain reorganizes experience over time. How consistency across multiple imperfect memories can sometimes indicate truth more reliably than a single vivid account. The defense cross-examined aggressively, pressing on margins. Could these theories apply to many situations? Were they definitive? Could alternative explanations exist? The experts agreed they could. They emphasized probability, not certainty. And yet, the accumulation was undeniable. As days passed, the emotional temperature of the courtroom shifted. The air grew heavier. The audience leaned forward more often. The silence between questions stretched longer. Then came the moments that seemed to change the rhythm entirely. A piece of evidence long considered insignificant was reintroduced, not as a revelation, but as a connective thread. Something mundane. Something overlooked. When placed against the reconstructed timeline, its relevance sharpened dramatically. The prosecution did not dramatize it. They simply placed it where it belonged. The effect was immediate. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Pens paused. Heads tilted. Even the defense appeared momentarily unsettled. This was not a smoking gun. It was worse. It was coherence. Another witness followed, someone who had remained on the edges for years, uncertain, conflicted. Their testimony was halting at first, voice low, eyes fixed on the floor. But as they spoke, a pattern emerged. A discomfort long suppressed. An intuition dismissed for years. They described behavior that, in isolation, seemed harmless. But placed alongside other accounts, it aligned too neatly to ignore. The courtroom felt smaller then, as if the walls had drawn inward. Cross-examination tried to destabilize credibility, probing motive, memory, timing. The witness faltered, but did not collapse. Their account remained internally consistent, even when pressed. The judge watched closely. So did the jury. Outside, media coverage intensified again. Analysts debated whether the prosecution had done enough, whether the narrative risked overreach. Commentators argued about the ethics of delayed justice. Social media fractured into camps, each convinced of their interpretation. But inside the courtroom, the case continued its slow, deliberate march. Toward the end of the prosecution's presentation, attention returned to absence, the central void around which everything revolved. The missing person. The unanswered question. A final expert spoke about unresolved disappearances, about how closure is often imagined as discovery, when in reality it is frequently recognition. Recognition of what the evidence has been quietly saying all along. They spoke about how communities adapt to uncertainty, how stories calcify, how time can dull urgency without erasing truth. Their words lingered. When the prosecution rested, there was no applause, no reaction. Just a stillness that felt almost reverent. Then the defense began in earnest. Their strategy was not to propose an alternate story, but to fracture the existing one. They revisited every assumption. They questioned every inference. They reminded the jury, again and again, of the burden of proof. They brought their own experts, who spoke of cognitive bias, of investigative momentum, of the danger of pattern seeking in ambiguous data. They argued that once a narrative takes hold, everything starts to fit it, whether it belongs or not. They emphasized the absence of physical proof. No remains. No definitive forensic link. No confession. They spoke calmly, persuasively. And slowly, doubt crept back in. The courtroom oscillated between conviction and uncertainty, pulled in both directions by competing logics. Each side constructed a reality that felt complete when considered alone. The tension was not explosive, it was cumulative. By the time the defense rested, exhaustion had settled over everyone. Not physical fatigue, but cognitive weight. The sense of having held too many possibilities at once. Closing arguments loomed. Outside, the community waited. Some gathered in quiet groups. Others avoided the news entirely, unable to endure the emotional whiplash. For families connected to the case, sleep came in fragments. 18 years of waiting had narrowed to days. Inside the courthouse, the air seemed charged, as if holding its breath. Because whatever the verdict would be, it would not just decide guilt or innocence. It would decide which version of the past would be allowed to stand. And in a case born from silence, that decision carried an almost unbearable gravity. The truth, or what the law would accept as truth, was close now. Close enough to feel. Close enough to fear. And close enough to change everything. Closing arguments arrived without ceremony, as if the courtroom itself had grown tired of anticipation, and simply allowed the final phase to begin. The lights felt harsher now, the silence more deliberate. Every seat was filled. Every breath seemed audible. This was the moment when months of testimony, years of investigation, and nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions had to be compressed into language strong enough to persuade. The prosecution stood first, steady, deliberate, almost restrained. There was no attempt to inflame, no raised voice, no theatrical pacing. Instead, they spoke as if assembling something fragile in midair, piece by piece, trusting the jury to see the shape take form. They returned to the idea of convergence. Not a single clue. Not a dramatic confession. But alignment. Independent strands that, when viewed together, stopped being coincidence. Behavior aligning with opportunity. Opportunity aligning with timing. Timing aligning with silence. Silence aligning with control. They reminded the jury how each fragment had emerged from a different source, a different year, a different perspective, and yet pointed in the same direction. They spoke of consistency without coordination, of patterns that existed before anyone thought to look for them. They asked the jury to consider how absence can be engineered, how disappearance does not always announce itself with violence or chaos. Sometimes it hides behind routine. Behind trust. Behind familiarity. They spoke carefully about responsibility, about how accountability does not require spectacle. About how the law does not demand absolute certainty, only proof beyond reasonable doubt, proof that grows not from a single moment, but from accumulation. They ended not with accusation, but with a quiet assertion that the story had been telling itself all along, waiting for someone to listen closely enough. Then the defense rose. Their tone was different, sharper now, more urgent. They spoke of danger. Not physical danger, but moral danger. The danger of mistaking coherence for truth. Of letting time harden assumptions into conclusions. They reminded the jury that humans are meaning-making creatures, drawn to patterns even where none exist. That once a narrative takes hold, every new detail bends toward it. They warned against retrofitting the past with present knowledge. They returned again and again to what was missing. No body. No confession. No direct forensic link. They argued that the case rested on interpretation layered upon interpretation, inference built atop inference. They challenged the reliability of memory stretched across decades. They questioned motives of late emerging witnesses. They emphasized the risk of confirmation bias in long-dormant investigations suddenly revived. Their message was simple, and repeated with precision: suspicion is not proof. They asked the jury to imagine the weight of a wrong decision, not just for the accused, but for the integrity of justice itself. They urged restraint, skepticism, courage to say, not proven. When they finished, the courtroom exhaled. The judge's instructions followed, methodical and exacting. The law was explained. The burden clarified. The standards reinforced. Jurors were reminded that emotion must not substitute for evidence, nor sympathy for certainty. Then, quietly, almost anticlimactically, the jury was sent to deliberate. The room emptied in stages. Observers filed out. Lawyers gathered papers. Families embraced or avoided each other. Outside, cameras waited, lenses trained on closed doors that revealed nothing. Deliberations began without drama. At first, the jury reviewed timelines. They asked for exhibits. They requested transcripts. Hours passed in careful discussion. Some jurors focused on consistency. Others on gaps. Some were drawn to behavioral evidence. Others remained anchored to the absence of physical proof. Conversations grew more intense, then quieter. Voices rose, then softened. At times, the room divided. One group argued that the story, taken whole, made sense in a way that coincidence could not explain. That the convergence of evidence, however circumstantial, formed a coherent truth. Another group resisted, insisting that coherence alone could not substitute for certainty. That law required restraint precisely when stories felt persuasive. They revisited testimony. Replayed words. Re-examined timelines. They argued not about facts, but about thresholds. How much was enough? Outside, hours stretched into a second day. The community waited. Some sat glued to news feeds. Others avoided them entirely. For families tied to the case, time became viscous, heavy. Every minute carried the weight of 18 years. Speculation filled the silence. Analysts debated signals. Commentators dissected facial expressions captured in fleeting courtroom exits. Social media swelled with predictions, theories, declarations of certainty. Inside the jury room, the atmosphere shifted again. A turning point came not from a dramatic revelation, but from a reframing. One juror posed a question that changed the angle of debate, not whether every piece of evidence was perfect, but whether any reasonable alternative explanation could account for all of it together. The room went quiet. They tested alternatives. One by one, possibilities collapsed under their own weight. Not because they were impossible, but because they required more assumptions than the prosecution's narrative. The discussion grew slower, more contemplative. Votes were taken. Then retaken. Some jurors changed their minds. Others held firm. Time passed. Eventually, consensus began to form, not in triumph, but in resignation. A shared recognition that uncertainty would never fully disappear, but that the law did not require absolute certainty, only moral confidence. Late in the day, a note was sent to the court. The courtroom filled again, tension thick enough to feel physical. People stood when the jury entered. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to still. The foreperson held the paper with both hands. The clerk asked the question. The answer followed. It was quiet. Almost anticlimactic. A single word, formal and restrained, carrying the weight of nearly 2 decades. A verdict. A ripple moved through the room, not an explosion, but a release. Some gasped softly. Others closed their eyes. A few wept without sound. The accused remained still, expression unreadable, as if absorbing the moment in slow motion. Attorneys leaned in. Hands touched shoulders. A life divided cleanly into before and after. The judge thanked the jury, voice steady. Sentencing would come later. Proceedings were adjourned. Outside, the reaction was immediate and fractured. Headlines ignited. Cameras flashed. Commentators rushed to frame the outcome. Some called it justice delayed but delivered. Others called it a cautionary tale about the power of narrative. Families issued brief statements, heavy with restrained emotion. Relief mingled with grief. Validation collided with exhaustion. For the community, the verdict did not close the wound so much as redefine it. The mystery that had lingered for 18 years had transformed, no longer an open question, but a settled one in the eyes of the law. Yet unease remained. Because even with a verdict, not every question had an answer. There were still gaps. Still silences. Still moments that resisted explanation. And perhaps that was inevitable. Cold cases, even when solved, rarely end cleanly. They leave echoes. They reshape memory. They force communities to reconsider what they thought they knew, and how easily certainty can erode into doubt, or solidify into belief. As night fell, the courthouse emptied. The cameras powered down. The crowd dispersed. But the story did not end there. It lingered in conversations, in late-night reflections, in the uneasy space between closure and doubt. It lived on in records, in transcripts, in the quiet knowledge that truth, once uncovered, never fully settles. And somewhere between the past that refused to stay buried and the future now permanently altered, the case took its final shape, not as a mystery anymore, but as a reckoning. A cold case, once frozen in time, now forever marked by a single moment when silence finally broke. The sentencing phase arrived without spectacle, stripped of the drama that had surrounded the verdict. The courtroom felt smaller now, quieter, as if the story itself were beginning to withdraw into history. What remained was gravity, heavy, unavoidable, final. The judge spoke slowly, carefully, aware that every word would echo far beyond the walls of the room. They recounted the weight of the conviction, the seriousness of the crime, the years of absence that had stretched like a shadow across a community. There was no embellishment, no moral flourish. Just the law, applied with deliberate restraint. Statements were allowed. First came those who had waited nearly 2 decades for this moment. Their voices carried fatigue more than anger, sorrow more than triumph. They spoke of birthdays missed, of unanswered questions, of lives permanently divided into before and after. They did not ask for revenge. They asked for acknowledgement, that what had happened mattered, that the loss had not been invisible. Some struggled to finish their sentences. Others spoke with surprising calm, as if exhaustion had burned away everything but truth. The room listened in silence, the kind that presses inward, forcing attention. Then the defense spoke briefly, formally. Words chosen with care, stripped of argument now that the verdict had settled the matter. They acknowledged the weight of the moment, the impact on all involved, the finality that now approached. At last, the accused was given the opportunity to speak. There was a pause, long enough to feel intentional. What followed was not dramatic. Not explosive. Just a few measured sentences, guarded and restrained. No full confession. No sweeping denial. Nothing that resolved the lingering questions. The words hovered in ambiguity, offering neither clarity nor comfort. And perhaps that, more than anything else, underscored the nature of the case. Some truths never arrive cleanly. The judge delivered the sentence. It was firm. Unambiguous. Heavy with consequence. A number of years spoken aloud, precise and irreversible. A ripple passed through the room, a collective intake of breath, followed by stillness. The sound of a gavel marked the end, sharp and final, cutting through the air like a seal placed on the past. Just like that, the legal story was over. But outside the courtroom, the meaning of it all continued to unfold. News spread quickly. Headlines updated within minutes, reshaping themselves around a new phrase: sentencing in long-running cold case. Analysts rushed to contextualize. Commentators debated implications. Some framed it as justice at last. Others as a reminder of how fragile certainty can be when time intervenes. For the community, the reaction was layered. There was relief, real, palpable relief, that the long uncertainty had reached an endpoint. That the case no longer hovered unresolved, no longer existed as a question mark etched into collective memory. But there was also mourning, renewed and complicated. Closure did not arrive as a clean break. It came unevenly, bringing with it echoes of grief that had never fully faded. People returned to places once associated with the case, a street corner, a familiar building, a stretch of road, and saw them differently now. Ordinary spaces carried new weight. History had rewritten their meaning. In quiet moments, residents spoke of how the case had shaped them. How it had taught caution. How it had altered the way they understood trust, routine, and safety. How a single disappearance had become a reference point, a shared memory passed down through years. For investigators, the end brought a complicated satisfaction. Not triumph, but resolution. The knowledge that persistence, however slow, had mattered. That revisiting old evidence with new eyes could still change outcomes. That time, while eroding memory, could also reveal patterns once invisible. Files were archived. Notes boxed. Digital records sealed. But the story did not vanish. It lived on in transcripts, in case studies, in quiet conversations between professionals who would reference it as an example of patience, of complexity, of the dangers and necessity of reopening the past. And for those closest to the center of it all, life moved forward in altered form. Not healed, not whole, but moving. Because closure, it turned out, was not a door that shut cleanly. It was a shift. A slow repositioning of pain. A way of carrying the unanswered alongside the resolved. Years from now, someone would stumble across the headline again. Colorado 2006 cold case solved. Arrest ends 18 years of mystery, and pause, drawn by the promise of finality. They would read the story, absorb the facts, perhaps feel a brief surge of satisfaction. But those who lived it would know better. They would know that beneath the neat framing of resolution lay a far messier truth, that justice can arrive late, imperfect, and incomplete, yet still matter deeply. That silence can be broken without being fully explained. That answers can coexist with doubt. And that some stories do not end so much as settle into memory, into record, into the quiet spaces where questions linger. The case, once frozen in uncertainty, had finally moved. Not into clarity, but into history. And there, in that uneasy space between knowing and wondering, it would remain, a reminder of how fragile certainty is, how long shadows can stretch, and how even after 18 years, the past can still rise up and demand to be heard.